Our next speaker is David Jurgens, who's an assistant professor at the University of Michigan. His research is in computational social science, and he uses NLP to discover, explain, and predict human behavior in large social systems. Take it away.
So can you all see my share screen?
Yep.
Awesome. So I'm happy to talk to you about a very different type of scientific text than what we've been talking about so far in the workshop. Specifically, we're going to talk around scientific journalism. And this is ongoing work with Hao Peng, who's a PhD student at the School of Information, and my professor collaborator, Misha Teplitsky. So I want to start with an example, which many of you may have seen, looking at this big dark matter experiment from the Xenon collaboration, where they had some pretty cool new results that showed up this week that may actually change the standard model. Some interesting stuff, I mean, who knows? But this generated a lot of press coverage. So press coverage both in traditional sources like the New York Times or BBC News, but also kind of scientific press coverage. So Scientific American covered it and CNET covered it. So science actually spreads quite a bit throughout the throughout the news ecosystem. And actually, it plays a pretty important role in academia as a whole. So we get things like, it's kind of the primary way in which scientific knowledge kind of diffuses to the public. That's how they hear about the stuff that we do, potentially in this workshop, is that it gets covered somewhere. It also raises a profile of the scholars. So it's like, if you actually get covered, it's something that kind of establishes your prestige or your esteem. And of course, it goes in the tenure packet. So it really can help shape the careers of like, I'm an important scientist who gets covered in the news. But if you think about who that scientist was, in that physicist, it was actually Elena Aprile, which may not match your normal ideas about who a scientist is. And so we have these kind of latent biases about who a scientist is. And we know that media coverage actually shapes a lot about who we perceive a scientist to be. So this is just a Google search from today of physicists. And there is some diversity here, but if you look at where the pictures come from, they come from the news. So news coverage of science actually influences our public perceptions of who a scientist is. And if you notice, most of the scientists coming from the news are white men. So this is kind of a strong, like, there's a feedback loop in terms of who we perceive a scientist to be. And we know that the scientific pipeline is full of inequitable behaviors. There's demographic and gender biases, there's prestige biases, and this actually has lots of effects on our ecosystem. So publications, citations, funding awards, all that sort of stuff. And so together that points to this bigger question of a leaky pipeline in science, where we have underrepresented groups, and as they make it through the pipeline, they drop off, and so we have fewer and fewer faculty for these underrepresented groups. And this shapes our perceptions. So getting to the point of this talk, we're really curious about who gets reported in news, because this too shapes our perception of who can be a faculty or who can be a scientist. And so our big question is there bias in science journalism in terms of who is mentioned? So we're going to use NLP techniques to try and analyze science journalism to try and get at this potential latent bias. So I'm going to walk you through three things today. We'll talk about the data for this. We'll talk about the methods, because there's lots to control for when you want to talk about bias. And finally, some fun results, which are not necessarily that fun, talking about bias here. So looking at the data, all of our data is going to come from Altmetrics. And you may have seen this. It's like the colorful circle that's like some sort of like citation, quasi-citation factor that talks about all sorts of public display of information around a news story. In particular, they aggregate all news mentions about a particular story. So they've given us access to around 1.7 million news stories, mentioning around 500,000 scientific articles. So I'll try to say like story for news stuff and articles for scientific articles, just to try and keep those mentally clear. And so this is from a lot of different news outlets. We're going to start there. I'm going to start from this Altmetric data. Due to like paywall restrictions and all sorts of access stuff, we're only going to get around 570,000 stories. And we're going to focus primarily on 72 US-based outlets, because we want to at least control for some sort of demographic bias. Also, there's news outlets in different countries that may have their own journalistic preferences. From this, we're going to link all these papers to Microsoft Academic Graph. So Altmetric has generously provided the DOIs for each of the paper, which is a unique identifier. But that said, it doesn't provide any other metadata on the paper for the most part. So we have to link it to something to get like the authors and where they're at and all these other institutional controls. And this will give us around 232,000 news stories linking to around 100,000 papers. And specifically the Microsoft academic graph gives us lots of rich metadata. So we get the names, we get like kind of a rank, like an H-index kind of thing. We get the affiliation of where they are. So if they're a top institution or a lower institution, keywords, publication year, all sorts of really good stuff that we want to control for. Media attention really isn't equally distributed. Like some papers, say for example, that dark matter experiment get a lot of press coverage. Some of us, if we're lucky, get like one site mentioned in a news story. So there is some quite a bit of diversity there. But surprisingly, news articles actually will mention work that's decades old potentially if it's useful. Maybe some of this is cherry picking, but there is quite a space for in terms of when newspaper articles happen. That said, most of our news articles come within the past decade. Okay, so here's kind of where the NLP really kicks in. We're going to get raw text, and what we have to do is basically pull out this news article. We're going to use newspaper 3K, which we think is the best package from our experiments. That said, we had to use custom regexes and a lot of HTML munching to actually get that text back out. We're going to try and pull out first author mentions, actually all author mentions to some degree, and we can actually find these in around 36% of stories. That said, it's not that there's missing data, it's just that many authors just aren't mentioned. And we'll also try to recover the reporter when we can actually get that out. And we can only get it for around 41 outlets where that's reliably preserved somewhere in the story. And even then we can only get it around 17%. So we don't have ethnicity. That doesn't come anywhere in the data. So again, we have to use some sort of NLP-like techniques. We're going to use a tool called Ethnia, which is from the University of Illinois. It gives us a bunch of kind of high-level or fine-grained ethnic categories, which are really much closer to like national categories, national origin categories. And that's that it's specifically trained on academics. So it does work well. And we're going to get kind of, we're going to try and aggregate these into like regional places. So kind of we'll get the parts of Europe where we have lots of different representation. We'll break Asia up into Chinese and non-Chinese East Asian. We'll have Indian, and we have a kind of a few African scholars as well in the mix. That said, ethnicity is very complicated, and certainly ethnia is not capturing the whole picture. So we're going to use two other techniques as well, just to get ethnicities for authors. One, we'll use Wikipedia. We'll train on info boxes to try to get, and we get a similar kind of high-level categorization. And then, just as a sanity check, we'll use the U.S. Census Bureau and try and train a classifier based on that. There, we only get white, Black, Hispanic, and then all of Asia is lumped into this Asian and Pacific Islander class. So again, these are not complete pictures, but ideally they provide some robustness checks for any sort of ethnicity decisions we want to come up with. So just to summarize again, we'll take Altmetric data, we're going to push it through, link it to the Microsoft academic graph. We'll use some NLP tools to analyze the ethnicity in text, and we're going to get around 232,000 news stories with 100,000 scientific papers. Okay, so that said, we're going to try and analyze that data. And the big goal is to test for bias in which first authors get mentioned. So first authors, as many of us know, they end up doing all the work, or the majority of the work, but they also are often the junior scholars who have the most to benefit. So being mentioned or not mentioned really can have the biggest impact on their careers in terms of prestige and the benefits of that prestige. So given this particular article, we'd like to know whether the first author gets mentioned, and we're going to build a logistic regression model just to test based on a bunch of other factors whether that author gets mentioned. So there's lots to control for. I'm going to try and sketch out three big realms of control variables that we'll try to build models around. So the first thing is authorship. So science doesn't happen in isolation anymore. It's often team science. So we're going to try and characterize the authorship on the paper. We'll look at the article, the scientific article, and the news story to try and characterize, are there aspects about them that would affect potential mention of an author in the story? And then we'll look at domain and topic, because certainly some topics attract much more attention than others these days and maybe get more press coverage. So controlling for that will be important as well. So for authorship controls, we'll add things like prestige. So we get something from Microsoft Academic Graph about the author rank and the institutional rank and prestige. We'll look for inside and outside the US, because certainly maybe if you're in a faraway country from the US and you're a US journalist, you don't want to have to like reach out to them because you're on a short deadline. We'll think about last name foreignness. So it says length and frequency in the US Census, and sort of the number of authors on the paper. So how many authors and the ethnicity of the last author. For author and story controls, we'll look at the article complexity. So this is from the abstract provided by Microsoft Academic Graph. The idea is maybe if your abstract is easier to read, a journalist is less likely to reach out to you because they can understand what's going on. But that said, there's actually not really good NLP methods for readability on scientific text, so that's one option for future work. We'll look at story factors like length. Certainly, there are articles that get mentioned 50 years after they were published, and maybe at that point, it's no longer worth reaching out to the scientist. We will also try to pull in the ethnicity of the journalist when we do have that data, but that's only for a small amount. And then finally, we'll add a few random effects for the fanciest models, looking at the news outlets, because news outlets do have their own idiosyncratic behavior in terms of how they cite authors. And we'll add random effects for publication venue, which it provides an additional focus on, additional controls for the topical focus, as well as prestige. So some outlets like, say, Science or Nature have direct feeds with different journalists, and that may affect mention rates because of how those press releases are handled. Okay, so we've controlled for the authors, the article, and story. Now we add domain and topic control. So again, we'll use Microsoft's academic graph. This is often because we don't have keyword or the full text to do our own analysis. So we'll look for any keywords that are mentioned in at least 500 articles. And this will pull in things like topics and fields, so kind of high-level characteristics of what this paper is about, as well as kind of low-level keywords like CRISPR or cannabis that may kind of spark a certain kind of newspaper discussion, or you're looking for certain things. So we get a few hundred of these keywords. Everything is not collinear. We've tested for all of that. So what I'll end up doing is I'm going to build an iteratively series of regression models that try to predict, will the first author get mentioned, controlling for all of this stuff. So looking at the results, we're going to try and answer 3 big questions. First, is there gender and ethnicity bias? Like, that's kind of the first thing that we need to establish if that is happening. So we know that there's lots of bias in the scientific pipeline. Does it happen here at the end of this life cycle for science? Does it matter who's reporting? So certainly there's different types of publications. Maybe there's certain, like for example, science-focused publications that do a better job. And then finally, are things getting better? So kind of spoiler alert, like there may be some problems along the way. So we'll try and take a look at like the bigger picture here. So looking at this first question, is there ethnicity and gender bias? Let's start with the simplest model. Let's not control for anything. Let's just literally put in the demographics. So I'm going to show these on the y-axis. On the x-axis, I'm going to show the log odds of being mentioned relative to a male with a British origin name. So that's going to be our reference category. So anything pointing to the left is less likely to be mentioned. And if you notice, the x-axis is all negative, so it's kind of like a general bad sign for things to come. But looking at the bar charts of the coefficients, we start to see that controlling for nothing, there is some bias that starts to pop up. So African authors, Middle Eastern authors, and female authors have some bias against them. But that said, we're not controlling for anything. So this is a bad model to start, but we got to start somewhere. So let's move ahead. Let's add more controls. So the chart I'm showing here is the one I just showed you, and we're going to iteratively build out this panel. Again, this is relative to a male with a British origin name. So let's start by adding authorship controls. And there we start to see, like, again, a bigger, badder picture, where now controlling for how many authors are on the paper, as well as the ethnicity of the senior author, we do start to see significant ethnic bias here. So again, African and Middle Eastern authors are more penalized, but we start to see a strong Asian bias start to emerge. And again, female scholars are penalized. Let's add a bit more control. So let's add story and author control. So this is like readability, how long the story is, how many years between publishing. So maybe because, but here this doesn't actually improve the situation either. So we again see that there's a strong anti-African bias and anti-Asian bias in terms of who gets mentioned in scientific stories. Of course, this isn't controlling for content. And we do know that science is definitely specialized and that scientists of different ethnicities and demographics are not evenly distributed across all the fields. So if we add those, we still see the same kind of bias, surprisingly. However, we do see one weird quirk. So we do see that women are no longer, there's no longer an anti-female bias. And what's going on here is that there are certain topics that the press does not like to cover, or when they do, they do cover them, but when they do cover them, they don't mention the authors, and that there's no difference between male and female authors who are doing work in that area. Neither one gets mentioned, but it seems like there's a strong topical confound there. So we don't see, we don't see any gender bias there any longer. So we're going to add one more model that's the complex, super complex model. But just to walk through the explanation story. So given a non-male first author with a non-British origin name, with similar intellectual status at a similar institution, working on the same topic, with the same number of co-authors, publishing in the same venue, whose work is mentioned in the same outlet, and is written by a journalist with a specific demographic. So controlling for all of those things, what do we see? So this is the plot I just showed you. And when we control for all of those things, we still see the same picture, which is, I mean, it sounds so redundant, but it's actually surprising that this is such a persistent bias when you control for all of them, that we start to see a strong anti-Asian and anti-African bias in terms of presence of those types of scientists, controlling for all those things in reports of published stories. We do also see that Europeanness matters. So more prestigious or perceived prestigious Northern European identities and authors from Romance language countries are sort of perceived as more core European, and they are less penalized. So you might say, well, you know, these are log odds scores. What's the actual effect? So what we're going to do is we're going to do a simulation study on top of the regression model and calculate the average marginal effects. So this is like controlling for all that stuff. What's the difference if we swap ethnicities in the actual rates? And I'll show this relative to a 0.36 probability from 0 to 1 of getting mentioned. Relative to this, we don't see that there's any female bias. However, we see a massive bias, again, for Asian and African authors, around a 0.7, which is a 20% drop, relative drop in being mentioned. So that's like 1 out of every 5 scholars from these demographic communities is not mentioned in a scientific story when they could have been, relative to their like male British peers, which is just crazy to me. There's just such a strong bias that just holds up. Okay, so there's a bias that's real. Maybe it could be due to an artifact from ethnia. You know, it's a reasonable conjecture. So this is ethnia's result. Here's Wikipedia's result. Again, that East Asian bias shows up. Here's with the census. And again, we only have a few categories, but you can see across all three, this anti-Asian bias shows up in terms of which scientists get mentioned for published papers in news stories. So it does not seem that it's an artifact of any of the classifiers. That said, we do see some difference around African. I suspect that this is potentially due to like less data in Wikipedia, unfortunately. Okay, so we've looked at this ethnicity and gender bias. Does it matter who's reporting? So we did a lot of like random cross effects to actually try and track this. Looking at all of them, short answer, doesn't seem like it. Doesn't seem like we found any systematic bias in the ethnicities of journalists that would explain this. Longer answer, maybe if you have more data, like when you do multiple hypothesis correction, nothing washes out. But there's a few things that maybe if we had a slightly more journalistic data that like maybe would be significant. But I don't want to report on that because it's not significant. Okay, does the outlet type matter? So we have general news stories. We have science and technology like Popular Science or Scientific American or Wired that are dedicated to this kind of topic. And we also have a certain kind of category called press release. So it's you publish a press release, your press office spits it out, and they will just wholesale take it up for you. So I'm going to show you the same kind of average marginal effects. Looking at press releases, we still see the anti-Asian bias is coming from our own universities to some degree. Looking at the science and technology outlets, we see an even larger bias. This is outlets that are dedicated to scientific journalism. And then in the news outlets, we still see the same bias. So this is kind of this anti-Asian bias is consistent across all the outlets. And it's, again, just surprising to us because there's a well-trained editorial staff and they publish longer stories. So there's room. It's not like there's a larger excuse for them to not talk about this. So are things getting better? Just to wrap up, this is getting towards the end. What we'll try to do is we'll fit separate models for each of the ethnicity categories and then calculate the average marginal effect per year. So this is like, for this one demographic, just year over year, are things getting better? Am I more likely to get mentioned? So showing this, again, we'll show it relative to we'll show it for all demographic categories. And what we find is that the most privileged groups, so males, British origin, and Slavic and German, they do seem to drop, but if you notice the scale of the x-axis, it's a very tiny change. So does not seem to be any strong temporal effect happening here. So just to sum up, is there ethnicity and gender bias? Yes, lots, but primarily around, almost exclusively around the ethnicity aspect. Does it matter who's reporting? Not really. We see consistent bias everywhere. Are things getting more equitable? Sort of, but not really quickly enough. So there's a few limitations that I do want to mention for the study. One is that we had this inferred ethnicity, and it definitely does not reflect all ethnicities, which is regrettable. We would love to study this, but we just don't have the tools to do it. That said, we have done some manual checking, and it seems like it is working as best as it can. And it is fairly accurate. That said, we don't also have any causal explanation for why this bias happens. And we've been trying to tease out what could be happening, but we don't really understand why it's happening. And finally, this bias is measured on top of an effects of an already biased system. So the scholars who are publishing these papers are the result of a bias system. So there's lots of stuff. So there's still gender bias in the whole pipeline, even though we don't find it here. With that, I'd like to thank you for listening and thank my co-authors, Hal and Misha, and many thanks to Altmetrics for giving us this data to study. And I'm happy to take questions. Thanks.
Thanks, David. That's a really interesting talk. We have time for quite a few questions. Boris asks a question: what are the topics that journalists cover without mentioning authors?
Oh, it's actually a lot. We do cover. I would say a lot of it has to do with food and health. So this kind of like chocolate cures cancer, and it's like, you know, researchers at blah 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 have found that like eating so much chocolate will improve something or other, but they don't actually cite the particular study. That said, I don't think we've seen anything specific to. We didn't dig too much into the topics there.
There was a question from Shali. Have you considered communication barriers? Perhaps foreign authors tend to respond less to journalists?
Yeah, so we tried to get at that with whether the author's home institution is in the US or out of the US to control for this. That said, all of the authors are writing in English language papers, so it's not that they are like not fluent in English to some degree. We didn't see any strong effect there either. But yeah, that's something we'd like to know. Maybe there is some sort of fluency playing a role in this.
Justin asks a question: any thoughts on the origin of this bias? Is it the journalists ignore these minority authors, or is it a discoverability issue such as search engine bias?
Yeah, I don't think it's the journalists. I mean, we did a bunch of poking around for, that's why we added all this journalist stuff. It is actually surprisingly tough to extract them from text. So there's a nice knowledge base extraction problem there. We didn't see anything systematic in terms of the journalists. We actually manually coded for their ethnicities too, for at least the most prolific journalists. It could. I wonder if it could be search engine. We are controlling for like the journal itself, like the venue itself, which so it should at least normalize for like discoverability across different venues.